مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. لم يسبق في التاريخ الأمريكي أن تشارف الحملات الانتخابية الرئاسية للحزبين السياسيين تقريبا على الانتهاء في بدايتها. بدأ التصويت في كانون الثاني يناير، وستنتهي هذه الحملات الانتخابية خلال الشهر الآذر مارس، ربما لأنه لأول مرة في التاريخ الأمريكي المعاصر يكون المرشحان نفسهما كما في الانتخابات السابقة، الرئيس الحالي جو بايدن والرئيس الذي يعتقد جمهوريون كثيرون أنه ما يزال الرئيس الشرعي دونالد ترامب. ما الذي يعنيه للناخبين من الحزبين ألا يتوفر لديهم الخيار للانتخاب مرشحهم للرئاسة، ومع الانتهاء المبكر للحملات الانتخابية من الذي سيملأ الفراغ السياسي؟ وهل قرر معظم الناخبين أيضا من سيختارون في الانتخابات تشرين الثاني نوفمبر؟ لمناقشة الحملة الانتخابية القصيرة وتأثيرها على الانتخابات الرئاسية، يسرني أن أستضيف نخبة متميزة من الخبراء السياسيين أليكس كانجيتانو، ستيف كليمنز وديفيد هوكينز.
Welcome back to Dackle, Washington. We had a big day in American politics, or at least what is usually a big day, Super Tuesday, the biggest day on the American primary calendar, but it didn't produce much news. In fact, it was, in the American colloquial, a bit of a dud. Let's explain what happened and what it means for our presidential election campaign with Steve Clemens, Alex Gangitano, and David Hawkins. All right, Steve, let's start with the Republicans. Donald Trump, a runaway train. What happened on Super Tuesday for him?
Well, he was mostly a runaway train, but he did not win everywhere, and he did not win everyone. Nikki Haley, his rival, who is now stepping out of the race, won Vermont. That's something. But I think the more interesting thing is, given the fact that most GOPers, most Republicans, knew that Donald Trump was going to prevail on Super Tuesday, there were still substantial portions that did not vote for him. And that raises really interesting questions when you get to the general election. Are they holding their nose and going to vote for Donald Trump? Are they going to stay at home? Or might they even support Joe Biden? So the story in places like Virginia, where still you had 35% approximately of people that did not go for Trump. So yes, Trump won overwhelmingly, but there are some potential warning signs for him beneath the surface.
So potential warning signs, but not enough to keep Nikki Haley in the campaign. Alex, she won a primary finally, but she was the last person standing, but she is bowing out. Why?
That's right. So I think, the writing's been on the wall for months that President Trump is the Republican frontrunner and will be the nominee. But I think for her, she was holding on, because there are, like Steve had mentioned, a lot of disillusioned Republicans who were looking for another candidate, who were looking for somebody like Nikki Haley to change the game and maybe don't want a rematch of Trump and Biden come November. But it looks like, that's what we're getting pending some incredible event happening. But I think within the Republican Party, Haley was getting feedback from big donors, from other politicians saying, somebody like you could be the difference that we need to prevent this rematch in November. But she just wasn't getting the legs with the American electorate. She wasn't getting the legs with the primary, and people that turn out for primaries proven to be, these Trump supporters. A lot are his base. But, as Steve mentioned, the numbers aren't quite there for Trump in order to show that he could really be a runaway candidate come November against Biden, because, he wasn't getting the same enthusiasm in these primaries. But Haley really wasn't getting anything at all. So I think it's just time for her to back out.
So two unenthusiastically supported candidates. Now, David, Donald Trump did get some good news recently from the Supreme Court. The judicial system hasn't always been good to Donald Trump, but it was good to him recently. What did the Supreme Court say about his appearance on the November ballot?
Well, to review, there is a provision in the Constitution that very few of us had noticed until a couple of years ago, which says that which was written into the Constitution after the Civil War, which said that if you had been an insurrectionist, to shorthand it just a bit, if you'd been an insurrectionist, you weren't supposed to get eligible to be on the ballot anywhere again for any office of federal public trust. The Colorado Supreme Court said this applied to Donald Trump and said that he couldn't be on the ballot. The Secretary of State in Maine said the same thing, and actually just last week, a state judge in Illinois said the same thing. Obviously Donald Trump appealed because he appeals every ruling that ever goes against him, so we always knew he was going to appeal. And the Supreme Court came back with a unanimous ruling, unanimous in its central holding, as they say, which was that individual states can't decide this. This is not something that we could have a hodgepodge of 50 different states ruling using 50 different ground rules that a president can or cannot be on the ballot. So to leave it there, the bottom line is Donald Trump may be on the ballot in all 50 states, will be on the ballot in all 50 states. This is probably the most important Supreme Court electoral issue since the famous Bush versus Gore Supreme Court decision that decided that incredibly narrow election a quarter century ago. It's not the last time that Trump's fate will be decided by or slowed down or accelerated by the Supreme Court. They're going to rule between now and June on the question of whether actions that he took while president can make him subject to federal prosecution after being president. If that happens, he may yet go to trial sometime before the election, or maybe right after.
So, Alex, if the primary battle is essentially over and the legal battle is over too, is there anything that's going to stand in the way of Donald Trump being the Republican nominee come November?
Yeah, I think even pending these legal battles, there really wasn't much as David mentions. He appeals all of these. They're caught up in court for months and months. So, I don't think that anyone should look at this election in November as not having Trump on the ballot and Biden on the ballot. Of course, there's been questions for months over the president's age and stamina, the former president's legal challenges, and if they actually will end up being the candidates. But I think that this is just the way that it's going to be, and there's nothing that could really upend this at this point, besides a health issue maybe, or something along those lines.
So, Steve, I have been blessed by being put on the distribution lists of both Donald Trump and Joe Biden's election campaigns, and I've seen ads of Donald Trump. Yeah, I've seen ads of Donald Trump teasing the choice of a vice president, which I assume is something to keep the electorate engaged because it's going to be pretty dull for a few months. Do we have any ideas of who he might be turning to for this?
Well, he's flirting with some favorite stars out there. He's been appearing on stage every once in a while with this young upstart entrepreneur, Vivek Ramaswamy. He was a complicated character, and Vivek, there's no doubt that Vivek Ramaswamy has a constituency inside the Republican Party. He's very obsequious to Donald Trump. But I got to tell you, just about everybody else in the country does not like this guy. But nonetheless, Donald Trump had this reality show called The Apprentice. He's in the show. But others in the show are people like Kristi Noem, Governor Kristi Noem, and Senator Tim Scott is another. And I think that as you and I have discussed previously, Senator Tim Scott is a very interesting choice because many people, I think, make a mistake thinking that all of Donald Trump's supporters are white supremacists. They are not. There is a fringe of white supremacist support in the Republican GOP party that might have problems with even a conservative black senator joining that ticket. But it's hard to imagine anyone breaking the back of the Biden machine more than Senator Scott. because he is someone that moderate Republicans, even moderate Democrats, many independents respect and like Tim Scott. He was the author with Senator Cory Booker of Opportunity Zones in depressed areas, creating economic opportunity in depressed areas. So Tim Scott is very interesting because it would create a wedge in the black community. And to some degree, that black community was what saved Joe Biden's efforts to become president and the nominee when he ran 4 years ago. So I think that is that, but there may be others. Kristi Noem is another possibility, I think, with less enthusiasm in the party. So but my colleagues here may know of other candidates.
But just on this question, I'm not hearing you mention the name of the candidate last standing, Nikki Haley. Is there too much water under the bridge, as we say in America?
Donald Trump has gone out of his way over and over and over again to say the one thing Nikki Haley is not running for is vice president. So he'd have to eat his words on that pretty significantly. But I'm glad you mentioned it, because the one thing with Ambassador Haley, she was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, so she's an ambassador governor. She's pretty well positioned from a name recognition point to potentially run again in 4 years. And so a lot of what we saw, many people said, well, this was stupid of her to go through this process. I really don't think so. She's pre-positioned herself as an alternative for the future, because I think she really does believe Donald Trump cannot beat Joe Biden. You can disagree with her on that, but I think that she's positioned now for the future opportunity, but not on the Donald Trump's ticket.
So, David, before the break, we now are going to have quite a long time. I mean, there'll be some mechanical primaries. People will go through the motions, but there won't be much enthusiasm. If you're Donald Trump, what else do you need to do over the next several months to stir up the enthusiasm among your supporters to prepare for what will be a close election in the fall?
Well, of course, the vice presidential, the Veep stakes, as it's known among political reporters, who he picks for vice president will create all this agita and excitement. I would add to the list Elise Stefanik, a member of the House Republican leadership, congresswoman from upstate New York, who has made one of the great political transformations in modern Republican politics, going from a never Trumper to a please, please, please pick me Trumper. I would put her high on the list. Other than that, he's got all these court cases, which he has turned political convention on its head and made appearing at courthouses around the country his main source of getting campaign attention. So we should remember there are four criminal cases. All the civil cases against him seem to be at an end. He's now ordered to pay about $500 million in civil fines to the state of New York and to a woman that he libeled and defamed, who the jury found that he was sexually assaulted her. But then there are these four criminal cases, each of which is lumbering along. The one that most of us think of as the least important in New York City, hearkening back to the days when he paid hush money to somebody to cover up his affair with a porn star. That's the least of them, and that's the one likeliest to go to trial. Then there's the Georgia case, which is sort of a hot mess for reasons we probably don't want to get into right now. And then the biggies, the two federal cases, there will be, as we said, going to the Supreme Court. There are other pretrial motions going on. The second federal case, which involves Trump's hoarding of classified documents after he left the White House and hiding the fact that he did so, that may yet go to trial. So campaign rallies, that's 4 years ago. It's appearing on the courthouse steps. That's his campaign platform right now.
All right, very good. Thank you. When we come back after the break, we're going to turn to the Democrats, Joe Biden, and how he fared over the last couple of weeks of primary elections in just a moment. My guests again today include Alex Gangitano. Alex is White House reporter at The Hill, where she was previously the lobbying reporter. Earlier in her career, she was a staff writer for CQ Roll Call, where she authored Heard on the Hill. Also with us is David Hawkins. David is senior editor of the American Leader. He was also the founding editor of thefulcrum.com, and he spent 2 decades as a senior editor at CQ and Roll Call, 2 must-read news sites covering Capitol Hill. And of course, we have Steve Clemens, who is editor-at-large at Semaphore and New International News Site. Steve had a long career in Washington with just about every significant media platform that matters in America, going all the way back to his service pre-media at the Nixon Center for Peace and Freedom. All right, Alex, let's begin with you on the Democratic side. All eyes were on the state of Michigan, where there was a campaign to get voters to cast a ballot for uncommitted, focused especially on the important Arab American voting bloc in that state, unhappy with President Biden's support for Israel in the Hamas war. What happened in Michigan?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the president for months has been facing backlash from fellow Democrats, largely the progressive wing of his party, about his handling of the war in the Middle East and his pro-Israel stance. So Michigan was the first time that people could head to the ballot box. There was a big push there for people to vote uncommitted as a protest vote. Michigan has a very large Arab American population who are very angry with the president right now about the situation in Gaza. There in Michigan, more than 100,000 Democratic primary voters cast ballots for uncommitted, which still amounts to less than 15% or so. There has been a large uncommitted push for against other Democratic politicians in the past. Obama also saw this similar numbers in Michigan back when he was running. So this isn't a new phenomenon, but it definitely shows this level of discontent among this population of Democrats. And then we saw in Minnesota, the same thing happen. Some 45,000 Democratic primary voters in Minnesota, where there's a very large Muslim American population, also voted uncommitted on their primary ballots. So, some people that as reporters talk to in this uncommitted party say that Biden still has time to redeem himself, and they necessarily wouldn't vote for Trump in the general election. And then some say that he's too far gone, he hasn't called for a permanent ceasefire, and they will never support him again.
So, Steve, how do you see this? Glass half full, glass half empty? It wasn't the 40% that voted against Lyndon Johnson in 1968 in New Hampshire. It was 15 or so percent for an easy vote that they could have cast against Joe Biden. Glass half full, glass half empty.
Look, I think it's probably glass half empty, and I think I agree with everything that Alex said, but I think it's beyond that. I think that for many youth, and I think there's a really interesting generational paradigm difference between the world that Joe Biden worked in with the Cold War, with things like Russia and Ukraine, means something different to people, the older generation that remember the Soviet Union, remember global conflict. I think the Israel-Palestine crisis in the Middle East also fits in that. So the way that many youth and people in colleges look at this, and they're ambivalent about Joe Biden, is they look at this as a race and social justice issue. And I think you're beginning to see some decay in other communities beyond Arab Americans, particularly the Black community. Again, we discussed earlier, has some ambivalence about this, and they see this in other terms than just U.S. foreign policy. That rather they look at it at that their leading Democrat is failing in one of the key social justice moments of the United States in this moment. And I think it should give the leadership in the Democratic Party some concern to see what's going on in places like Minnesota and Michigan. But I also think in an election where just a shift of a few percentage points can make a real difference, they need to look at other communities as well.
Clearly, if the Gaza war is still going in autumn, it's a big challenge for the president. But it's a long time between now and November, David. If these voters are energized by what's going on today, could they flip back and come home to Joe Biden by November?
They could. They also will be paying attention to what Donald Trump is saying. And as we're talking about this now, just the other day, Donald Trump, I believe, the words that I heard him say, and it's sometimes hard to translate him, is that Israel should be even more aggressive inside Gaza and even more assertive than it's being right now. So I'm not sure that the crowd that voted uncommitted against Joe Biden is certainly not going to move towards Trump. I think the big story here, the 10,000 foot, 30,000 foot story is first rematch in 70 years, and we have neither candidate commanding a unified party, commanding enthusiasm. The amount of voters who are disdainful of the fact that they have to cast a vote in this rematch again is growing all the time. I think that one of the things we need to look for, as Steve said, there are only a half a dozen states that are competitive. There are a few thousand votes in each of those states that could make a difference. I think what we're going to be seeing is an enormous drop in voter turnout potentially. It was a record 4 years ago. 2/3 of the people who could vote voted. That's an American record. I would be not surprised at all to see that number drop significantly, and the share of people deciding to cast a protest vote or vote for a third-party candidate could be at an all-time high. Robert F. Kennedy, the son of the late Attorney General, nephew of the former president, is not on the ballot in all states, not going to be on the ballot in all states, but he is going to be on the ballot in several swing states, and he could make the difference in several swing states. There's this organization called No Labels that is trying to come up with a centrist ticket. They still haven't decided whether they're going to do it. I think they will. They've spent $70 million to get on the ballot in many states. If they come up with a compelling ticket, that person can draw, I don't know, who knows, 10% of the vote. There's a guy named Cornel West, a very prominent black academic leader who has some following in the black community. Black turnout is key to Joe Biden. If Cornel West wins, a few thousand extra votes in Detroit, Philadelphia, Charlotte, North Carolina, that could make the difference.
All right. Alex, we asked you earlier what Donald Trump is going to do to try to jazz up the base during a very quiet number of months, because there won't be any active electioneering until fall. What's Joe Biden going to do? And how does he try to change the impression over the next several months that he is, as the prosecutor said, an elderly man with a memory problem?
That's right. He does have to turn around a lot of people's opinions about his age. And as you mentioned, he's been dragged for it in special counsel documents. And of course, from Republicans, that he is an elderly man with memory problems. And so I think we need to see him traveling on the road. We've already been told that he'll go to some pivotal states like Georgia, like Philadelphia, to take his message on the road, to talk to voters there, to show that he's vibrant and has the stamina for these kind of speeches and this kind of campaigning. The former president is only a few years younger than Biden, yet people do find him to be more vibrant and find age to be less of an issue when you look at polling. So I think the president has to show that he has the same energy as Trump does, if not more.
All right. Thank you very much, Steve Clemens, David Hawkins, and Alex Gangitano for joining us this week on داخل واشنطن.
إلى هنا تنتهي هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات، وخاصة حول العلاقة بين الانتخابات التمهيدية والتصويت الحقيقي في تشرين الثاني نوفمبر، أرجو التواصل معي على تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو الكتابة إلي مباشرة @Rob Satloff. وحتى نلتقي في الأسبوع المقبل، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.